I'm going to reframe the question a little bit to get us to think through a different avenue. So, in terms of what it's like advocating or kind of doing work on Palestine, the way that I see that we can look at it best is what is it like to advocate for kind of broader movements of liberation, and specifically, I wouldn't say that what I do is advocating, or I don't really call myself an activist either. Um, for me, at least personally, because this my identity is politicized, it's kind of a matter just of an obligation and a duty to your own identity, especially one that has been dominated with ethnic cleansing and occupation for decades. Um, and I think that most people who kind of get into this work as well um, understand that there are kind of different avenues of issues involved that come with the work, the nature of it, and that includes kind of censorship, also self-censoring yourself a lot, depending on whatever field you're in. So let's say for me, I'm in the media field. I have to self-censor myself a lot on social media, just solely because of my identity. And so it's very different for other people who are not Palestinian but can speak out publicly, right? It's also kind of different for people who, let's say, are youth who are getting involved in Palestinian liberation work. And they kind of have to look at their careers, they have to look at their academic careers, they have to kind of look at their family, their reputations online, and kind of they have to juggle all of those because there are multiple censorship avenues with websites such as Canary Mission, which creates essentially a dossier of anyone who talks on Palestine or organizes on Palestine. So essentially, kind of in a long story short kind of answer, to do this kind of work takes a really strong person. It also takes a person who understands that although you might have something to lose, it's not as bad as ethnic cleansing um, and Israeli apartheid. So that's kind of what I'll say for that question, and then we'll pass it on to Sid.
For me, getting involved in solidarity for Palestine is kind of an outgrowth of the values that I was raised with. Most Jews today have been raised with a loyalty to or an adherence to Zionism and Israel. I wasn't. I was raised with universal values in which everyone should be treated with fairness and equity. And the more I learned as I was growing up about the history of Israel and Palestine, the more I realized that what was being done to the Palestinians was the antithesis of justice, fairness, and equity. And the irony is that Israel, which has done unspeakable things to the Palestinians, continues to do them, paints itself successfully and largely in the public eye as the victim of the Palestinians. It's a complete inversion. I think can be attributed to the very successful efforts on the part of the Israeli government and Zionist forces in the world that have created a narrative of the poor, afflicted Jews who were fleeing, and they landed in Palestine, and the hostile Palestinians didn't greet them and have been resisting Jewish return ever since. And I think that's just a myth and it's a fiction. The desire on the part of the Zionist movement long before the Second World War, long before Hitler and the Holocaust, was to colonize Palestine. The original Zionists were explicit about this being a colonizing effort. They used the terminology. Today, that terminology has gone out of style and it's not looked upon positively, but they were explicit because Zionism arose in the era of settler colonialism that was taking on all of Africa and the other parts of the world. And this was just seen as the Jewish manifestation of this. So in a nutshell, I think that the project was illegitimate because it was designed to create a Jewish homeland in which Jews enjoyed privileges and Palestinians were ethnically cleansed from there, and those who stayed have been put at a legal and institutional disadvantage and subjected to inequality ever since. And for me, this has to be opposed. until very recently, the media, the mainstream media, has been overwhelmingly dominated by Zionist perspectives, in some instances, Zionist personalities. But there was almost a complete inability to focus any attention, get any real reportage in the mainstream media on the plight of Palestinians. For the confluence of circumstances, just very recently, I think in Israel's latest attack on Gaza, things went offside with the Israeli plan, and the world, I think, has recoiled in revulsion. And all of a sudden, things are opening up in the mainstream media. I'm not saying adequately, I'm not saying they're doing the proper job, but much more than was the case before that. And in fact, the CBC has been hiring commentators, young people of color, who I think go along with the longstanding prevailing Zionist narrative, and maybe the conditions for them to be willing to sign on as employees is that they would have the ability to do some honest reportage on this. And so for the first time, I've seen stuff that at least bears some kind of resemblance to decent reporting in the mainstream media. We have lots more work to do, but that's one thing. The other thing is that there are organizations like Honest Reporting Canada, which act like Zionist watchdogs. They come down like a ton of bricks on any reporter that says anything that's remotely sympathetic to or even honest about the plight of Palestinians, to a ridiculous degree. But that seems to be breaking down, and that's part of what we want to do in our organization, is break that down.
Essentially, popular media, kind of echoing a bit of what Sid said, in the past has been dominated with pro-Israeli voices, or just commentators who essentially lean towards the Israeli perspective more so than Palestinian perspectives. And this is partially due to the many kind of social media policies that are in place at media outlets. And part of this is that they actually don't allow journalists, they don't allow reporters to specifically say Palestine, or to say it even in passing on various channels when they're kind of speaking to each other. And they also don't like to use the word Palestine in a lot of coverage, because according to them, there is no Palestinian state. And so therefore they can't use that term. Although it's explicitly stated in the United Nations Geneva Accords that you can use the term Palestine. So part of the reason why the media coverage on Palestine has been so awful is because of the language that's being used, that's put by these social media policies at these different media outlets, that also repress a lot of what journalists can say. And essentially, if they were to kind of go against that or violate the so-called policies, that would result in termination, or that would result in essentially any kind of public backlash. And another thing is that a lot of the times the language that's used by the media is because of this publicized language that has been so essentially normalized in mainstream. So words like apartheid, occupation, one state solution have never really been used in the media until, I would say, the past 5 years or so. And even just in the past 3 months, we saw a lot of different statements coming out from journalists themselves who have explicitly said that we need to have a right to factually use language that represents the accuracy of what's happening in Palestine. And so those words do include saying occupation. They include saying apartheid instead of conflict, or land dispute, or housing resolution, as they really like to say in Jerusalem and what's happening there. It also goes hand in hand with a lot of the language that we saw that was being used in the past 2 months, actually, by outlets like the Associated Press, Reuters, and the BBC. They like to use words like clashes, both sides. They also like to blame Hamas a lot. And fun fact, Hamas wasn't even created until years after the Israeli state was created in 1948. So this kind of justification that essentially Palestinians bring on their own suffering because of Hamas, which is essentially a resistance group. And again, under Geneva Accords, occupied people have the right to resist by any means necessary. A lot of the times the media tries to kind of downplay severity of it and use various resistance groups as a justification to Israeli oppression. So that's essentially where the media has gone really wrong. And because a lot of the reports and the language that is used really does, um, it really does essentially influence public perception. That's kind of why we see the narrative has gone a long time to favor the Israeli side. And it's also because of a lot of pro-Israeli lobbying, pro-Israeli advocacy within the media itself. A lot of outlets are owned by public outright Zionists, and so essentially they're able to kind of shift the type of reporting that is being done. They're able to kind of shift the stories that are being centered. Um, a specific one comes to mind, like the New York Times. They have a lot of awful reports on Palestinians. They use a lot of reports that blame them again for Hamas. And so this has very recently just changed. And again, this is only because I actually connect this with grassroots organizing. So the only reason people are actually changing the language that they use, and the only reason the media is catching up to this now is because of grassroots movements, organizers who have been organizing for decades in their local environments, essentially, to push for different words, to push for different initiatives that are centering what's happening in Palestine and being able to call it what it is. And that's essentially kind of this atmosphere that we're in right now, that has kind of led to this awful perception on Palestine within the media to kind of very, 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 very slowly getting to kind of a place where we can use accurate words.
Just to pick up on what you were saying, Dalya, I think social media has provided channels for information on reportage on Israel-Palestine that people are using, and they're not satisfied with the mainstream media and its complete blackout of what's actually happening on the ground, and they're able to use social media to that end. And in terms of the popular resistance to this, something really crazy happened. I think illustrates how bad the mainstream media has been. The CBC National Radio has a daily show called The Current at about 8:30 or a little after 8:30. About 4 or 5 months ago, they were interviewing a guy named Joe Sacco, who did an illustrated novel on the situation in Palestine. And I can't remember the host's name, used the word Palestine. And the Israel lobby came down on him like 10 tons of bricks. And the CBC apologized and retracted the use of the word Palestine. The guy's illustrated novel is about Palestine. I mean, it's so bad that they weren't even allowed to use the word. But I think our organization made a major effort on that one and just shamed the CBC, their staff, and everything. You call yourselves journalists? You're apologizing for using the word Palestine. We just kept at them and kept at them and kept at them. We'd like to think that we contributed to the breakdown in that to a degree anyway. I think that the iceberg has begun to crack a little bit, not nearly to the degree that it needs to. I mean, you've got a story like what's going on in the Green Party today, where the Green Party leader is being painted as the victim of vicious anti-Black anti-Semites, because people in the Green Party objected vehemently when her staffer, who is I think a really cranked Zionist, attacked their sitting MPs and argued via a Twitter post that they should be unelected. Now, I used to work for a union. I've been involved in political parties. Staffers don't say things like that. They don't play such a role. He said and did that, called for them to be unelected, and the leader did nothing about this. And so there was a demand from the rank and file of the Green Party that this guy should be disciplined or terminated from his position for going way beyond the role of a staffer. And all of a sudden, she is being painted as the victim for having failed to respond for weeks on end to this call, which I think was a completely legitimate one. Regardless of the rest of the issue within the Green Party, this was a matter of a staffer who deemed himself able and clearly willing to go way beyond the role of a staffer because he was so convinced in his militant Zionism. uh, the reportage on that today in Canada is terrible. It's really, you have to look far and wide to finally, get a handle on what's really going on there.
I would say that kind of looking at the recent landscape that we're in, just based off the what was called the Unity Uprising or the Unity Intifada, which also means uprising, in May, the past 3 months, there has been a huge shift in terms of what actual organizers can do, what they can say, and kind of going off on the momentum that we saw in May, because over the past maybe 10 years or so, 15 years or so, Palestinians in occupied Palestine have been really repressed, and they haven't been able to go out and do any popular protests. We haven't really seen that type of unity before. So in May, we essentially saw protests all over historic Palestine. We saw them from Jerusalem. We saw them from areas that are essentially predominantly Palestinian citizens of Israel. So essentially those with Israeli citizenship coming out to protest. We saw those in the West Bank coming out to protest, in Nablus and Jenin. And those are people with different kind of ID cards, specific ID cards that are meant to separate them from Palestinian citizens of Israel. And specifically also those in Gaza, they came out to protest. They're in a literal enclave, a blockade that's been over there for 14 years, and they still went out to protest. So this was kind of a political moment that we had seen maybe once or twice before during the first and second Intifada in the 80s and in the 2000s, where Palestinians were fed up and went out there to do some kind of popular resistance. We saw that very briefly there. But then when we saw this again in May, it was a different context because again, it was the unison that came out, which really shifted and pushed organizers in North America and in Europe to take that momentum and to actually channel it, because now people could not deny, especially after a video that went viral over a settler taking a home and saying, again, I'm pretty sure most of you have seen this video, like, one of the residents, Munal Kurd, was asking, like, why are you stealing my house? And he said, if I don't take it, someone else is going to. And so people could no longer deny that explicit message within the video, although it was unfortunate. It took over 73 years for people to see that within a viral video. That moment itself was the defining point of Sheikh Jarrah. It was the defining point of the Unity Intifada that really shifted the landscape overseas. And it really essentially pushed people who had never spoken on Palestine before, such as labor unions or health unions, to put out statements in support. Academic institutions who had potentially never really said too much, professors who had never said too much, sign on to statements, write statements as academic institutions in support of Palestinians. All of kind of these little pieces of the domino effect really shifted the environment that essentially allowed grassroots organizers to push more initiatives like local boycott initiatives, divestment movements, military divesting as well, because right now the US has purchased $38 billion of weapons from Israel again, and local organizers were able to kind of repress part of that movement because of what we saw in May. And so, although I don't say that, this was a very unprecedented moment, because again, Palestinians have been doing this for decades, this specific moment in the global sphere has actually allowed a lot of different movements within the organizing scene, within the advocacy scene of Palestine movements, to really shift the narrative, because now there's more people listening in terms of city councilors, in terms of government officials. Again, not saying that liberation comes from governments, but we have kind of a wider audience listening, and we have these people kind of in this momentum that we can use to push different initiatives. So I see that that's kind of where the movement is right now. And slowly, again, when the media coverage dies down, organizers are still doing this work, but the landscape definitely has shifted in terms of who's listening and what can be said now, without kind of that bigger backlash that a lot of people fear. I think that, yeah, just like within the question itself, the second part of the question, I don't look at it as a sacrifice, although again, tied to any essentially liberation movement, and more so in Palestine because of just the increased Israeli lobby or the Zionist lobby that's prevalent in North America. Um, I look at it as the way that if there was something to be sacrificed in the first place, then it's not worth it. And second of all, I think that in terms of sacrifices such as work, self-censorship, this has also kind of started to shift a bit because now students, youth, younger professionals who are just entering kind of the job scene and starting their careers are no longer too worried about any kind of backlash on their advocacy for Palestine, because now we have institutions actually starting to wise up to understanding that this is an attack on kind of freedom of speech, freedom of expression. It's also kind of follows the movement PEP, which stands for Progressive Except for Palestine. And we have a lot of those in different kinds of human rights movements, liberation movements, resistance movements, who are essentially advocate for everything except for Palestinian liberation. And so I think that in terms of kind of the struggles that I face personally, the challenges oftentimes, at least for me, are mostly self-censorship. I tend to self-censor a lot of what I do want to say on social media, and that's only because I'm considered a public figure just in my career. But I think that it's also, I've challenged a lot of that narrative, and within challenging that rhetoric, like being afraid to say something so simple as like Israel is an occupying state, just even challenging that notion makes it so that you can break down the status quo way easier. It also makes it so that people are following into your footsteps and saying this stuff online. And so I think that for other challenges that I've faced, oftentimes they've been mostly kind of Zionist attacks, kind of hacking, people trying to get me fired from my job. What else? I think a lot of it has to do with mostly Zionist attacks. For the challenges, I faced a bit of challenges within my own career because in journalism as well, there's a lot of self-censorship. There's also a lot of social media policies in place that kind of state what you can or can't post. People essentially monitoring your feeds all the time. And I faced, like I was even fired for confidential information. I'm kidding, but I was fired for like a few days at one point because I had posted something when the UAE normalized with Israel last summer. And essentially I was posting what was a political analysis of what was happening. And because the lobby is so deep in every part of your workplace, no matter where you're at, there will be kind of a backlash against that. We've seen multiple people get fired, whether they're professors, journalists, students, whatever it is. We've seen this happen. And so these are somewhat kind of the challenges that I faced. I never really see them as sacrifices, honestly. And I think that's because there comes a certain point in time, and it's different for everyone because I am Palestinian, so I can't really run away from this. But for other folks, they can take more security measures. You know, they can make sure that all of their accounts are secure. They can make sure if they don't want to be using their names online, they can go anonymous. You can still kind of organize for the movement there. But for me, at least, it's gotten to a point where I'm kind of solid, foolproof, that I don't worry too much in terms of kind of backlash. And it's because everything I say is foolproof. Everything that I do, whether it's writing an article, whether it's doing a panel, again, everything is just, I kind of stand behind that. And I think that's what a lot of the times when people get into these little challenges, whether they're smears of anti-Semitism, false accusations, of course, if they're false accusations, or if they're just essentially someone trying to get you fired or kicked out of your school, people start to get really scared. And that's essentially what the point of the Zionist lobby is, to get you to fear, to get you to back down. to go private, to delete everything you posted, to stop advocating, to stop essentially partaking in any local campaigns. And so when you don't actually fall into that trap, you're going to be solid. You're going to, like, no one will be able to kick you down, right? So those are kind of the challenges that I faced specifically. Another challenge that I think most of the times people don't really discuss specifically for this is kind of the toll on mental health. I think that myself and just many other Palestinian friends who are also working in fields like law or academia as kind of grad students or grad candidates, the toll kind of dehumanizing within these institutions. So there's kind of this normalization of anti-Palestinian racism, anti-Palestinian rhetoric, or kind of seeing them from this third-party perspective, which does take a toll on actual Palestinians within these institutions, because a lot of the times people start to fear their own identities. They start to kind of self-censor. Maybe they don't want to say they're Palestinian. They start to say they're Arab. They start to hide a lot of the organizing that they do. So that does take a toll on mental health. It also kind of makes it so that this anti-Palestinian racism is very normalized. And the issue here is that we don't actually have a category for anti-Palestinian racism. We have a category for all types of racism, oppression, anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, and we have kind of these policies in place to make sure that we're effectively combating them. But then for anti-Palestinian racism, people don't actually know what that is or what it looks like. There isn't really a diversity or inclusion policy in place that can tackle that as well. And that's part of the issue with that mental health perspective. And yeah, I'm gonna stop right there and let Sid go ahead.
I personally haven't experienced career challenges, anything like what Palestinians face. I mean, I know people personally, Palestinians, who've been actively involved in the struggle, and they've been approached by their employers and told, okay, enough of that. Or they've been approached by the Canadian government and said, oh, you want to get your family into this country, that's not going to help. These kind of not so subtle hints to make people back off. The kind of challenges that I face personally, and I think that IJV faces, is to get Jews who have been taught to love and adhere to Israel and Zionism, that they've been lied to and manipulated, and that this is not a haven, that this is an oppressive state doing terrible things, and that they are not the people who are under threat today. I mean, I don't know how closely you're following this, but this National Anti-Semitism Summit just took place with Erwin Kotler sponsoring it, with Trudeau and several members of his government in attendance. And they're all trying to make out that Jews are under mortal threat in Canada, that anti-Semitism is welling up all over the place. And as evidence of this, they quote statistics from B'nai B'rith, which is a complete hidebound Zionist organization. And our organization has done some very powerful analyses of B'nai B'rith and its statistics on anti-Semitism. And what they count as instances of anti-Semitism includes things like people using the phrase, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. That's deemed to be anti-Semitic. It's deemed to be a threat to Jews and things like this. So one of the difficulties we have is that we're trying to open Jews' eyes to the realities there. And we're trying to formulate the stuff we do and the things we write in publications and stuff like this in a manner that will help break down this propaganda effort that has been so successful in the part of Israel. And that's often quite difficult. But in the most recent event that Dalya was talking about with the Unity Intifada, Israel's behavior has become so grotesque that it's becoming obvious to everybody. The instance that she talked about with the settler saying, if I don't steal your house, somebody else will. This is in the area of Jerusalem called Sheikh Jarrah, where Palestinians who were cast out of their homes in 1948 and others in 1967 are being cast out of their homes a third time by settlers, with the aid and comfort of the Israeli police and the military. So even, you know, a place like CBC is having news cameras there, and people have eyes in their head. They can see what's going on there. At the same time, there were mobs of right-wing racist Israeli Jews running through Jerusalem screaming death to Arabs. Stuff like this is kind of difficult to make into self-defense and invert into a threat to the Jews themselves. This has reminded me very much of the KKK and its treatment of Black people in the States. So I think that that's also contributing to the breakdown in the successful propaganda efforts of Israel and its supporters. I mean, it's kind of difficult for people who see that to continue to adhere to it as a manifestation of self-defense and I don't know, a place of safety for Jews, when it becomes clear that what's really involved is the displacement of and oppression of another people on an ongoing and now escalating basis. So our difficulty is finding ways to open people's eyes more and more on that.
I also wanted to add just another thing super quick that I forgot to mention as well. The other thing that I would also say that is a challenge that's external is state surveillance and state repression. So that really does hinder a lot of movements, and specifically I'll say like surveillance on the Muslim community, the Black community, Indigenous community, essentially anyone deemed a marginalized member of the community. There's a lot of surveillance there, and this also is in part because of the military system and the policing system as well that favors this type of surveillance system on people of color. And so we saw this last summer when the George Floyd protests were happening after he was killed by the cops. There was a lot of state surveillance of protesters. A lot of them were arrested for kind of the local grassroots work that they were doing. Even folks who weren't really necessarily involved, but were just attending protests. This is also part of the state breakdown and the crackdown on liberation movements. And so specifically the struggle here with the Palestinian movement is that not only do we face state surveillance and state repression, but a lot of the times Palestinians, other Palestinians, not like myself, so I have Canadian citizenship. Technically, I'm safe from deportation or kind of concerns on my immigration status, but there are other Palestinians not so lucky who essentially are still kind of within that immigration process, who kind of have to decide between organizing for their freedom versus being deported from this country that, again, we are settlers in. So there's also that tidbit that does make a lot of the work difficult, despite how outgoing you may be, because of that, right? And a lot of the things that we have done to combat this is kind of targeting specific surveillance members. So let's say we have Boeing. So I'm gonna drop some examples. Boeing, LB Systems. These are all complicit, either selling weapons to Israel or buying weapons and selling them to different countries. They also sell different types of surveillance methods that surveil your phone, GPS, and make it so that organizers have to kind of take extra precautions to talk and coordinate on different campaigns and different local actions. And so all of this does hinder the movement, but organizers in the Palestinian movement have kind of understood that you have to have digital security training, you have to have training on how to combat surveillance and how to combat state attacks, and also kind of knowing your rights and being able to fight for your rights without bringing in the policing system. Because a lot of us in the movement, again, we don't collaborate with the cops. We don't necessarily, again, believe cops make it safer for Black folks, Indigenous folks, Palestinian folks. So that's another really big challenge. That is an external one. It's kind of beyond your reach, that I think has slowly gotten better within time, but just something for people to be aware of as well. There is targeting from all different kinds of avenues.
just one thing that Dahlia mentioned that spurred a thought in my mind. George Floyd died under the knee of that cop. That is a technique that is employed by Israeli cops. And the Israeli cops have done police training exchanges with police forces across Canada and the United States. And so there have been campaigns to put an end to that reciprocal training and all. So feeding off some of the worst aspects of what's going on and trying to use that to open people's eyes. And I think in the context of what happened to George Floyd, and if people learn that this is happening to Palestinians all the time, if you look at my Facebook page, well, not right now, I've got a different thing, but I had a picture of an Israeli IDF soldier with his knee on a Palestinian protester's neck. So, I mean, you don't need a great deal of imagination to see the parallels. And if you're outraged by the one, you're likely to be outraged by the other. Jews, I would say that the population is divided in thirds. There are some who are hardcore Zionists, there are some in the middle who don't have strong positions, and there are some who are strongly critical of and in opposition to Israel. And so get a lot of blowback from Zionists and supporters of Israel. Criticism, we're called self-hating because we don't sign on to the settler colonial project and stuff like that. Other difficulties, though, is going to people in the middle who don't want to go offside the community, and they're concerned about being alienated from the community, so they'd rather take no position. Even though it's important for us, not everyone is willing to put themselves on the line and risk the fact or risk the possibility of being alienated from friends and family and relatives. And that often happens in this context, where there's just cleavages within friendships and families over the issue of Israel and Palestine. But I think over time, there's sort of a hardcore being refined of Zionist supporters, Israel right or wrong, it doesn't matter. And I've seen things coming out from Zionist supporters recently on Facebook and elsewhere that are outright racist. They're saying, okay, you know, if you're going to say this is a settler colonial project, what's wrong with that? You know, I mean, they'll go to the wall with it. But I would say, my estimation, most people don't have that kind of fanatical adherence to or loyalty to the project. And if you draw comparisons between settler colonialism in Israel and settler colonialism in Canada, people aren't going, for instance, they're not going to respond with indifference or worse to the discovery of 215 children's graves in Canada. There are some who will, but what I'm saying is that ordinary people, when they're confronted with evidence like this, it hits them and shakes their beliefs and their the way they've been propagandized, and helps open their eyes over time. And in this respect, Israeli behavior has been, the outrageousness of it has been contributing to, I think, the breakdown in the loyalty to and support for Israel and what it does.
I don't know how to answer this question. I don't really think there's too much of a common response. I think because the work that I do, again, like, I don't call myself an activist, or the work that I do is just advocacy. I think that it comes in different shapes and formats. So a lot of the things that I do kind of complement one another. They complement different areas of the Palestinian movement, whether that's individually by myself or within the PYM. And that's kind of, you know, writing opinion pieces, kind of doing policy reports. So essentially, like, one thing that I'm working on right now is police exchanges between the Vancouver Police Department and the Israeli military. And so that's something that is not specifically on Palestinian liberation, but it does complement the movement. It complements exposing how intricate the Israeli occupation and how Zionism essentially has kind of manifested in just all aspects of life globally. And so I think that when people kind of see the work that I do, or just see something I've written and they're like, oh, hey, I read this article you wrote. It's just, it's not like I can't really, I can't really describe what the response is. It's just something that's kind of part of my life that I do. So a lot of the people that I do surround myself with are doing something similar in nature, whether it's in their own perspective fields, whether it's in kind of academia. I have many friends who are grad students who are working on post-colonial theory within Palestinian decolonization, and they're not in your kind of typical sense an organizer, but they are contributing to the Palestinian movement, right? So I think that in terms of kind of responses, it varies. If it's a Zionist response, obviously it's not a response that you really care about. If it's kind of a response from family or friends, most of the time it's just like, hey, I saw something you wrote, or I saw you on this webinar, like, awesome job. Typically that's really it. And because I do surround myself with folks who are doing similar stuff, even in different movements. And I think that's something else that I don't know if was mentioned too much, but the Palestinian movement is actually very, very global in terms of its reach and in terms of its intersectionality, because a lot of the collaborations that we do is essentially to strengthen joint struggle relationships. And a lot of the joint struggle relationships that we do globally is on Black Palestinian solidarity, Black Indigenous solidarity, Black Palestinian Indigenous, those three together, like that is one of the things that we prioritize because it's very similar in terms of the oppression. Of course, there are differences, but it's one thing to strengthen a movement is to kind of build that joint struggle base. And yeah, that's what I'll say for that answer. I guess I've seen a lot of impacts in various different ways. So on a more individual basis, I think that the impact that, and this goes with kind of anyone who's writing something, there's obviously an impact for the audience that it reaches, for the person who reads it and kind of connects with it. I think for individual impacts there, a lot of the pieces that I've written have gotten comments from people or feedback from people who are like, oh, I actually didn't know about this. I didn't know that this connection existed within, let's say, foreign policy, or I didn't know Canada was so involved in selling weapons to Israel. And so kind of these are the different feedbacks that I've typically gotten on various parts of individual work that I do here. And I think that does create a easier context to navigate, especially in Canada, especially in terms of understanding that Canada itself is a settler colonial state and connecting that with Palestinian liberation as well as Indigenous liberation. So it makes kind of this atmosphere way easier when more people are reading, educating themselves, and not kind of living in an ignorant bubble. And I think on a more larger efforts, a lot of the work that I've seen have impact is kind of the IRA campaign. So, or as people know it, the IHRA campaign. Within PYM, we worked on a campaign last fall when Ontario adopted this definition of anti-Semitism that essentially includes criticisms of Israel to be labeled as anti-Semitic. And so we essentially created a campaign on that. We had webinars on this. We did local lobbying within the government, and we saw a lot of the impacts being made there, where a lot of the different members of parliament came out and said, actually, no, these examples of the state of criticisms of Israel is not actually included in this. And so a lot of backtracking, a lot of vague answers, which did work well in our favor, because then they're not going to be able to kind of arrest someone based on what they've said if they've kind of put out a very vague response to that statement. There's also other wins like military targets. So PYM did a campaign on Boeing last year, essentially targeting one of their main offices in the San Fernando Valley in California, in other states in the US that we were part of, that essentially got Boeing to reduce a lot of their military numbers to Israel. And kind of all of these different campaigns, in one way or another, they shift the stage They make huge impacts, whether it's a social media campaign, a social media storm, whether it's a military target, whether it's kind of a local initiative. Again, like something else that we're doing here is we're trying to make the intersectionalities between the police in Vancouver and the police in Israel. And that campaign on its own is already, we haven't publicized it yet, but we've already got folks in our focus groups kind of learning newer stuff, you know, understanding that a lot of the tactics that the VPD uses here are tactics the Israeli military uses. A lot of the tactics American police use are tactics that because they were trained by the Israeli military. So kind of these little impacts make a huge difference in terms of the environment that you're in, the environment that you're organizing in, that you're working with. So I can keep going on and on, obviously, for years, but I think those are just, you know, some examples.
Picking up on the example that Dalya just talking about, I put in the chat, IJV has put together this noihra.ca website. It explains what the IHRA is and how it's being used to suppress criticism of Israel. The issue arose here in Vancouver, I guess nearly 2 years ago, when the local Canadian or Jewish Federation tried to get the Vancouver police on side with the effort to have the Vancouver Municipal Council adopt the IHRA definition. So our local chapter worked with allies all throughout the community and people on council and all this. And our position was, first of all, this isn't anti-Semitism, it's criticism of Israel. And the two are not the same. And IJV is ideally situated to explain the difference between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism. And the second thing is that our position was, and it resonated, is that if you're going to oppose racism, don't pick out anti-Semitism as if it's some kind of, that Jews should be privileged victims. You should deal with all forms of racism, anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, anti-East Asian, and attack racism per se at its roots and its institutionalized manifestations. And that message resonated here in Vancouver. The same thing happened when the attempt was made to pass the IHRA in Montreal and in Calgary. That's the good news. The bad news is that the forces behind Israel, the Zionist lobby, don't give up. Erwin Kotler is probably the most prominent Zionist in Canada. He has been made the delegate from Canada to the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance in Europe, by Justin Trudeau. And Kotler was empowered to pull together this anti-Semitism summit, which is basically an attempt to institutionalize the IHRA across the country, because they haven't had successes in the various local areas. We've succeeded in blocking them in many instances. They want to get this totally top down with the backing of the federal government. So we've got good news, we've got bad news, which means that some of our work has succeeded and we've got more work to do. But I think, again, this is an instance where the more people learn about this, the more they come in our direction. So we just have to redouble our efforts.
I think for this one, a lot of the times I would initially say go beyond social media. Social media is like the bare minimum, the easiest thing you can do, like post something on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, wherever it might be. But a lot of the times what people are looking for and what Palestinians are looking for is material support. It's actually attending your local actions, it's supporting your community members, going beyond, again, just that online step, coming to these actions, meeting them, getting to know them, talking to them, understanding kind of the work that they want to do, maybe collaborating on an event, collaborating on a campaign that they're working on. It's also kind of being a part of your local boycott movements. And if there's no local boycott movement, start a boycott movement. If there's no Palestinian organization, start one. If there is essentially, you know, like a group of youth who want to start something, that's something so easily done. Um, and bringing forth a boycott motion is it's very simple to do, and it's also one of the bare minimums that people can do, because the BDS movement, although it was started by Palestinian civil society, it's more of a liberal movement, and because it only targets what's seen as illegal under international law. So, and as Palestinians, we know obviously we want more than that, but the BDS movement is a really good start to get some kind of accountability under international law. So, introducing a boycott motion, whether you're at a school, whether you're to your local city council, which is something that people have been trying to do in Vancouver. These are all very small actions. They do require research, obviously, and people to do this with you, but they are something that require material support, and they actually make a difference in terms of what you're doing. Because honestly, like social media, I could care less if someone's posting something. Like, I don't really care if you're posting on Instagram. Like, I want to see you come. I want to see you support your local members, or even write something about it. Platform Palestinian voices, platform Palestinian work, research that's being done, attending kind of events that Palestinians are doing, and kind of listening to them, seeing what they're doing, spread that work that they're doing too, because a lot of the times there are these amazing Palestinians who are activists or journalists, writers, who are living even in occupied Palestine, and a lot of their work doesn't actually reach international level because it's very centered to kind of one area, and because people tend to listen to voices such as myself as opposed to Palestinians under occupation. And so, kind of seeking those people out, or asking folks who maybe don't know, something as simple as following them as well on social media, boosting a lot of the work that they're posting. And yeah, the BDS movement is a really great start, I think, to go beyond social media. And I'm going to cap it there until I think of something else.
I was adding in the 3 calls in the BDS call for what? I thought I had knocked myself offline from them. I don't know if we disagree on this, Dalya, but I think that the 3 calls of the BDS movement, ending Israeli occupation and colonization, recognizing the rights of Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality, and respecting, protecting, and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes. I think if those could be achieved, be fairly significant, not pro forma. So in terms of what I think people should do is, I think you should educate yourself. You have to read and be able to cut through Israeli propaganda. And that requires doing some reading of history and analysis of the underlying issues. I mean, you can get involved in BDS right away, but you can also be derailed from this by propaganda lines. And what I found very useful was, I finally got so frustrated with trying to cope with one line after another of Israeli propaganda. I did some concentrated reading, and a book like Ilan Pappe's Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. And you read how bad the whole issue was from its inception, what the project was. It's very difficult to be distracted or derailed in your dedication by one-liner propaganda lines. But if you don't have that solid understanding of what's going on, then you can be deflected or distracted from things. So I would advocate that. And again, I agree, get involved in any way you can at the university level, community level, talk to people to open their eyes to the core realities of what we're talking about. I mean, this is a decades old situation of terrible oppression that needs to be addressed. And if you look at it in the context of every other struggle for justice in the world, there's no reason that people who are on side liberation movements elsewhere should make an exception of the Palestinian cause. It doesn't make sense. Interesting, I started out, I don't know if it's because of the people I talked to, a lot of the Israeli revisionist historians. One of them is a terrible right-winger, a guy named Benny Morris. He wrote a book called Righteous Victims. And he is on side with the entire Israeli project, but he does meticulous historical research. And so in reading his book, I read the same facts and came to the opposite conclusion that he did. So I would suggest read substantive magazine articles, things like books if you can, take courses if you can, go to lectures, look for stuff online. Look for Pappe. Pappe's got a lot of lectures online, and he's very accessible. There's a local guy, Gabor Mate. I should have pulled out some of these URLs before we started. He's done some lectures. He's going to be speaking to IJV's annual general meeting. He is a Holocaust survivor who was a Hillel youth activist when he was young, and he decided he was going to become the greatest Zionist he could. And so to that end, he wanted to educate himself and know everything there was about Israel and Zionism. And the more he delved into it, the more he realized that the whole thing was a complete lie. And he's done a complete 180, and he's now one of the most articulate people I know on the subject of, Israeli injustices and support for Palestine.
I'm going to jump in and say support Palestinian books, support actual experiences from Palestinians, because while Israeli historians are necessary to counteract a lot of what's being put out there and to dispel a lot of the information that Zionists put out there, actually reading firsthand accounts from Palestinians themselves, such as the 100 Years War on Palestine by Rashid Khalidi is a great start. The Question of Palestine by Edward Said, another very good start for beginners. Very simple to read, but encompasses a lot of the history just in kind of a chronological order. An amazing book. I'm not too much of a big fan of Noam Chomsky, but he has one of the books. He has a book on Palestine. It's a good read as well. Other books that I would suggest as well is Angela Davis. Freedom is a Constant Struggle. So she connects the ways Palestinian liberation is connected to Black liberation. That's a really good book. And again, just kind of centering a lot of Palestinian authors and writers. I think those are the two good books to start with. And again, yeah, like as Sid was saying, kind of education, popular education is very important for folks to just go beyond, especially for people when they do enter the Palestinian movement. They're coming in at different levels and they're coming in at different political spectrums. And so it's very important that they actually do the reading. And even if they can't do the reading, attend workshops, attend popular education that's being put on by different folks, so that they can kind of grasp an ideology and grasp the understanding of what different ideologies mean. Because in the Palestinian movement, there's so many people on opposite spectrums. We have Palestinian capitalists, we have Palestinian liberals, Palestinian moderates. I personally identify with the PFLP, which is the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine Party. A lot of what they do is secular, Marxist, revolutionary work. And so there's all kinds of spectrums. Another book I would suggest, or another person to read, would be George Habash and Ghassan Kanafani. And again, Edward Said, one of my favorite academics. So kind of learning a lot within the movement itself would save a lot of time, would save a lot of headaches, because sometimes people get in there with really good intentions and they kind of get bombarded with folks who are more experienced, who are like, oh my God, like, you believe this? Obviously, again, like, everyone's on different levels. So just kind of reading, brushing up on your own education, and just learning about kind of the different areas of it. To be perfectly frank, right now, Palestine is super trendy. So it's like the perfect time to get involved. Like, I'll be honest. It does annoy me that people come to protest, take photos, and then go home and never do anything again. But at this specific time, for those people who are looking to get involved, it is the perfect time and perfect place for it, because the movement is growing so much. Recruits are growing for different local movements. Um, and right now, that popular support is still gaining support, and it's still going, even if, the attention has died down, or even if protests have died down. But it is seen as like this, cool trend to jump onto. So I would definitely say that to people. They're embarrassed to say that, but it is what it is. Another thing that I would say that is to just take the necessary precautions. Again, if folks want to stay anonymous online, that's something that they can do. Very simple method to ensure that they don't get any Zionist attacks or any attacks on their careers or their academic educations, their families, their homes, anything like that. And anonymity is obviously one of the key ways a lot of organizers stay safe. Um, Another thing that I would say is to start very, very slow. So potentially reach out to a local organizing movement who could, educate them through a political workshop, attend even webinars, attend panels. Very simple thing to do from the comfort of your own home, and then kind of slowly start doing that local organizing. Or even if you want it, like, writing is very important. It's such a strong tool that um, generates thousands of responses and audiences. So those are kind of a few of the different things that I would say.
It depends on the person. If they're generally oriented towards social justice, it'd be crazy for them not to embrace the Palestinian cause. If they're not oriented towards social justice, I guess you have a larger task, which to tell them why they should be generally oriented towards social justice, and within that, pro-Palestinian. But it seems to me that the general climate today is increasingly attuned to issues of social justice, confronting racism, sexism, inequality, and stuff like that. And within this context, I think that Palestine is a prime example of everything that needs to be addressed. I mean, it almost encapsulates everything. I worked for a trade union in Vancouver for 30 years, and one of the ongoing frustrations I had there was the conservatism and the bureaucratic nature of it, and the hesitancy to address issues of social justice generally, let alone Palestine, which would be, within that context, would have been deemed to be extreme. I think what's happening now is, I'd like to think what's happening now is that there is a growing appetite to broaden the purview of unions to include more issues of social justice. Just recently, the Canadian Labour Congress pressured the national NDP to embrace an arms embargo on Israel and a boycott of products from the West Bank and settlements. That's not what everything we want by any means, but this is the first time that the Canadian Labour Congress has been willing to go on record and to pressure a political party to take such a stance. So, I mean, I see trade unions as social justice vehicles. Many people in and out of unions don't see it that way at all. They argue that unions should stick to issues of dollars and cents and working place issues purely and simply, and leave politics to somebody else. I think that's crazy. I mean, I think it's very destructive of the power and ability of unions themselves. In the situation in South Africa, there were some unions that played a very central role in the growing BDS movement that helped bring down the apartheid government there. I think that unions could play and should play such a role here in relation to Palestine, but it takes more work, because as soon as there's any effort to address these issues within a union, Zionist forces within union and without come and jump on them and make such a kerfuffle that, I mean, and that this is the tactic to convince unionists and union politicians and bureaucrats that it's just more trouble than it's worth. And so you have to have people who are really dedicated and focused and able to see their way through this kind of interference tactically and strategically. And that's what we have to build with, among trade unionists and here and elsewhere.